Today I'm here with Gayna Lynn Condie. She is so accomplished, I don't even know where to start. She's written 17 books. She's been on hundreds of podcasts. She's been on Good Things Utah for, is it 7 years now? So you probably recognize her from that. She's a light and example to so many people for a lot of reasons. Even to me personally, just getting to know her a little bit. You've been through some really difficult things in life, and yet you've been really willing to share how you were able to overcome those and how you were able to find hope during really difficult times. One of the things that you've been through before, if you don't mind talking about, is you have lupus. You've done chemotherapy, is it 3 times?
Yeah.
Chemotherapy 3 times.
Yes. Weekly for a year, low dosages in pill form. So if people are familiar, and that's because lupus is an autoimmune disease. So my immune system is attacking my heart. I have a heart condition with lupus. And so it's a pretty extreme treatment, but it helps quiet the immune system down in hopes that then the lupus quiets down, so to speak. So I did a year, then I had a 5-year break, then I did another year, then I had a 5-year break, and then I did another year. And those last 2 times, I was a mom, and that was a different stewardship experience. And so I'm pretty much an open book, and we could talk about whatever you want to talk about.
Oh, I love it because you have so many fascinating things. What you said just now is that was a different stewardship when you had your kids. What do you mean by that?
So people that know me, or I wrote a book a year ago that came out called the Stewardship Principle. It's a principle that I learned about 10 years ago, and a friend introduced it to me in this book that I thought there was a whole chapter about it, but when I went back to write the book, it was 1 sentence, and it had just such an impact. And basically, the quick answer is, if you're a parent, I can explain it way fast, because I think parents really get the opposite of stewarding, which is ownership, where we want control over what our kids, and we take a reference to, if they're making these choices, then we're doing a good job as a parent. The opposite of that is stewarding. And when your babies are young, you steward in a different way than when they're 18. I have a 19-year-old and a 26-year-old.
And you look so good.
Oh, thank you. And so parenting looks different. In stewardship, it's really healthy because it allows you to parent in a way that doesn't take ownership and sabotage the relationship.
Yeah.
But everything in our lives is a stewardship. Your beautiful home is a stewardship. This podcast is a stewardship. My lupus diagnosis is a stewardship. Sometimes stewardships are fun and exciting and fabulous, and they're trips to Hawaii and a new car and a promotion and a new baby or a new marriage or you graduate college. But all of us are living a version of life where there's a mix of hard things and difficult stewardships and exciting ones. And so for me, I very much saw lupus as a stewardship. It taught me a lot about caring for my body. I was newly married when I was diagnosed. There were just these random symptoms that showed up. And I was trying to get through school and get a teaching degree. And I was running an after-school program for the YMCA.
Of course you were.
And I was going to a YMCA training for the weekend and got sunburn by just being in the car. And my feet swelled up, and we didn't have health insurance. We were poor college students, and we were just trying to figure things out. And so we went to the doctor, ran a few tests and blood work, came back, and within a few months of diagnosis, because back in the day, you didn't want to get certain diagnoses because they stayed on your record, and then you couldn't get insurance. That's changed over the years. So my doctor was slow to try to put the official diagnosis until it moved into my heart. And then he had to kind of say systemic lupus, which means you can see it in my joints, in my hands, but really for me, the biggest involvement was in my heart. And they said, you have 10 years to live and you'll never have children.
And this was how long ago?
This was 30 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah, I've been married 32 years, so I had to do the math.
Wow.
And
Congratulations. That's
thank
amazing.
you. And so the first few years were just kind of getting through school and keeping me alive. But in my soul, I knew I was going to be a mom somehow. I didn't know how it was going to be. And so it took 7 years to have our son and then another 6 years to have our daughter. So they are true miracles. And that 10-year mark was 22 years ago. So everything after that has been a gift.
Wow.
Yeah.
I love your perspective on that, like choosing to be a steward over even hard things. I've actually never thought of it that way. Like this is a great opportunity for something good to come out of this. That's mind-blowing to me.
Well, let me say this. Even writing a book about it doesn't mean I don't go into the opposite thinking, which is
Sure.
ownership. The reason it's a principle is that it's a lens you can see life through, and you can choose in or out of it. All day long, I choose in and out of it.
Yeah.
And in the book, I kind of talk about the voice that I know I'm either in stewardship or I'm in ownership. And with parenting, I know I'm in ownership pretty fast because I'm wanting to take away agency and have control.
Yeah.
I start to focus on the outcomes of my kids, and that's not always helpful. And sometimes I overreach, right? Those are some signals for me I'm in ownership.
Yeah.
But when it comes to my body, like for example, with a chronic illness, it's easy to go in the opposite. Comparisons are one of the quickest ways I know I'm in ownership. And all of a sudden it's like that neighbor's training for a marathon. Well, that's not how my body works, right?
Yeah.
Or what I'm feeding my body or how I'm moving my body or how I'm treating my body is really about stewarding for me, because the gift has been I've had to learn that if I don't take care of this machine, it stops. And that's helped me be a little more gentle. I still can go into my head, right?
Yeah.
And as I've aged, lupus has changed, and it gets affected by hormone changes. And so for all the perimenopausal women out there, right, I've had to get in a different headspace about what does care look like, and how as my body, how can I age gracefully, and how can I be honoring what this teacher has been for me. And so, that's just one example. I think sometimes like our family's gone through job loss, multiple job loss situations. And when you start to see the hard things as a stewardship, it doesn't mean it's not hard.
Right.
I just say that if you live a life as a steward, the good stuff is better and the hard stuff's easier.
I love that. And I love that you put that in a parenting aspect, because sometimes it's like, we can take credit for the good things our kids did, but then it's really detrimental when we see that they didn't do something good. They did something bad.
Right.
And now we're like, I'm a terrible mom.
Well, listen, I'm going to say I wish I had known this principle sooner. I kind of learned it when my oldest was a teenager, and that was a helpful time to kind of reframe how I was seeing his choices and my interactions with him. But man, if you can learn it before your kids are adults, because parenting adult children, they are not in that place where you have access every day. I think when your kids are young, you feel like, oh, I'm being a good mom or dad because they're fed, they had a play date, they got their homework done, and they're in bed, and you have control over who are we going to have a play date with?
Yeah.
And is that the teacher that's the best teacher for them? And is that the right coach for them? And right. And then as your kids get older, your access to them and influence in their lives changes.
Oh, that makes me so sad.
It is. And yet I also see now my relationship with, especially my oldest, has turned into a different kind of relationship as adults. And if I stay in stewardship, my access stays good. But nobody as an adult wants your parent to call you and tell you how to choose this and what to do with your house and how to do this career choice and who to date or all those things. So I'm not saying it's easy, but it's oftentimes a preservation of a relationship.
Yeah.
And if I switch into ownership, I can feel it. And my kid can feel it. And they don't want to call. Like the other day, my son called me and just wanted to tell me about an experience he had had and something funny he had seen. And I just thought, okay, if I can stay in this space where he understands that as a mom, I've messed up and I was learning how to be a mom. And when they handed me that baby at the hospital and I went home and all of a sudden I'm supposed to make sure that he's healthy physically, emotionally, spiritually, and mentally, that's a lot. And I was learning. And I always say first kids, I'm a firstborn, they're your first pancake. Yeah. And so my stewarding has continued to evolve. And once your kids are adults, man, it's so crucial to preserving that relationship. If you want to stay in relationship, stay in stewardship.
Okay, what's the name of that book again?
The Stewardship Principle.
The Stewardship Principle. And I actually just got it in the mail today, and I was so excited to read it. And
it's 68 pages, and so it's not overwhelming. And it was overwhelming when God asked me to kind of write a book about it, because it was a principle that was so powerful for me.
Yeah.
And I wanted to write it in a way that if you had never heard about it, you would understand it.
Very basic.
Very basic. But then if I had talked about it on podcasts and I had talked about it on my show at the time and when I have opportunities to speak. And so people that had started to hear me talk about wanted to know more. So I tried to write it from both perspectives. Like if you had never heard about it, or if you had heard me talk about it, but you wanted more. And so I break it down into different categories, like education, career, relationships, parenting, health. Wow. just to give ideas of how to apply the principle, because it's not something that like I figure it out and I never struggle with it again.
Right.
I find myself going into comparisons or control or perfectionism. Those are all signs I've slipped into ownership. And ownership's kind of a buzzword right now. Like everyone's like, take ownership of your life.
Yeah.
I don't love it because, especially with our relationships, if you start taking ownership of your spouse or your kids, especially, you shut those relationships down. I like stewarding because what I think people are saying when they say take ownership, they're asking you to be intentional about your life. Being a steward.
And own up to your mistakes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Being a steward is still being intentional.
Yeah.
When I'm in stewardship, I am intentional.
Wow.
But when I'm in ownership, I literally like take away people's agency and I get perfectionistic and I go into comparisons and it just shuts me down. Versus stewarding feels very much expansive. And for me, it's a God thing.
Yeah.
Not everyone that hears this conversation with you and I maybe see God in their life that way or have faith as part of their lens.
Yeah.
But for me, it's a very sacred space when God's like, I'm trusting you with a lupus diagnosis. I'm trusting you with infertility. I'm trusting you with, for those that know me, my sister's suicide and mental health issues or chronic health issues or financial struggles or divorce. All of that is stewardship. And when you see it that way, God isn't punishing you. He's not like rewarding your neighbor with all the cool stewardships and you're getting all the hard stuff. He's really trusting you. Some of the most inspiring people are ones that have been on your show that are like public about some of their really hard stewardships, right? And what they've taught us as they've stewarded really hard roads.
That is so mind-blowing. I love that you just said that God is trusting you with this hardship. Like, wow, I haven't thought of it that way, but you're right. You're right. He's giving us an opportunity to grow. That's great.
There's a funny meme going around on social right now that like, I think it's something like, God, I'm just phoning you to let you know for 2024, like, I don't want to be on your righteous, exalted list, right? Because the joke is really sometimes we are hurting and in pain, and we know God's trusting us, but we want it to stop. I want to be sensitive that there are those out there that have been asked to steward some really heavy things back to back.
Yeah.
Right? And so this isn't to be Pollyanna. I'm not trying to say, oh, it's so easy.
Well, you've been through stuff. I don't think you can be Pollyanna. You've been through stuff.
I've been through some stuff, but I will say that I'm sensitive to the fact that this doesn't necessarily take away the heaviness of it. Yeah. But for me, when I start to see it that way, then I don't feel this distance with God. And just for me, if God's a part of it, somehow he can inspire me to do one more day, try one more thing. And that for me is hope. Wow,
that is so beautiful.
Thanks.
I love that. You mentioned your sister. Do you mind telling us what happened with your sister?
I love talking about Meg because at the time of this taping, it's been 9 years. She died of suicide at the age of 40, and I'm the oldest, and so she felt like my kid more than my sister, and for oldest in your audience, they'll understand that. She had had a lifetime kind of battle with she had been a victim of sexual abuse. She had dealt with some mental health issues chronically and some addiction and learning disabilities. And the reason I share those stewardship lists is that there's a lot listening to this podcast that deal with those things. They check those same boxes. Yeah. And so the risk factor for someone that, maybe is a child of divorce, which we were, sexually abused, learning difficulties or differences, her risk factor for suicide was higher. But the reality, and I work full-time in this space, which means no matter what podcast I'm in or speaking event I'm invited to speak at, I always squeeze in mental health. Because for me, mental health is health. Like, we all wake up each day and we should be checking, just like we check our physical health, where are we at with our mental health? For me, it's just health. And I think especially post-COVID, we all have mental health needs. Yeah, do we not?
Definitely.
We all should be having conversations around mental health. I will say that Meg's story in 9 years of sharing it, I feel like she's my partner and my mission companion in this because of her, I've been able to talk about a really hard subject in a way that has opened hearts. And one of the things I will say is there's no simple answer to solving the problem of suicide. It's complex. So her story is complex. The solution needs to be complex. It's not like a one or done magic thing that if we just all start doing this, suicide's going to go away. I think we need to talk about mental health in a way that normalizes it, and we keep having the conversation, because you never know. The day we placed her headstone was the day Robin Williams was found.
Oh.
And I remember as a family thinking, okay, the whole world understands suicide grief today. Because here is this happy, creative actor that we all loved, that on the outside brought us all this joy and happiness. And I have two sisters that have passed. I had a sister die when I was 10 and she was 2 and she had a heart condition. There is a grief with suicide that's unlike any grief. And really, I've done probably 3,000 keynotes around the world. I've, published multiple books and hosted weekly shows. And what I've found is every person on the planet either struggles with mental health or has lost someone, like our family has. That's all of us. And so first and foremost, let's just normalize that suicide grief is a different kind of grief. It creates for families and communities kind of a what if. And so when people ask me, why did Meg die? I can tell them her risk factors, which I've shared some of them here. But the why is really she got tired. And I think we can all relate to that, where we believe kind of this lie. One of the things I share when I share her story is Meg believed the lie ultimately that we would be better without her. Oh. And my life isn't better without her. All the books, all the podcasts, all the speaking, all the TV, radio, my life's not better without her. But she's definitely my partner in talking about a really uncomfortable subject. And when we talk about uncomfortable things, it's kind of my jam. Like, I value talking about the uncomfortable, awkward things so that they start to feel comfortable. Yeah. And I love when men talk to me about their mental health, because men are the number one group dying by suicide, middle-aged men. And when I'm asked why, the reality is women generally, I'm overgeneralizing, we do this. We sit down and we
talk it out.
Yeah. We text each other. We get on Marco Polo. We may listen to podcasts and send them to a friend. Can we just normalize that the men in our lives, the greatest gift they can give us is when they go to therapy and come home and sit down at dinner and say, I went to therapy today.
Oh, that's so great. Yeah.
When men say, I'm not doing okay, it scares them that somehow we don't trust them, or they're not providing, or they're not culturally strong.
Yeah.
But the reality is, when I'm traveling for business and a businessman, by the time we land, has told me more about his mental health than his wife and his best friends know.
Wow.
That's normal. That's normal for me.
Well, you've created a safe space.
Right. And it's easier for them to tell me, hey, right, this is where I'm struggling, or this is what I'm dealing with. And it's been going on a long time. So I hope anyone hearing me talk about Meg, she was an awesome basketball player. She loved a good road trip. She loved a good dance party. So I planned her funeral and I hired a DJ. And we had the church. So we totally just had a dance party. And some of the older people at the funeral were like, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? And it's like, because she loved a good dance party. And
that's what she would want.
She would have wanted that. And I feel her often. I definitely feel like I feel her less the longer she's been gone. I think in my faith belief, she's busy learning still. And so if someone's listening that has lost someone they love to suicide, culturally we're doing better about saying they're not damned, they're not lost forever. Yeah. We used to really teach that across the board, not just certain faiths or religions, but across the board. It was like, the reality is your loved one got tired. And so what can we do to have conversations where therapy, I could talk about this all day, and so I don't want to be a fire hose about information, but for me, therapy is education, and no one's embarrassed about more education. Mm-hmm. Like if I told you I'm going to go back and work on a master's degree, you'd be high-fiving me.
Yeah, I'd be congratulating you.
Yeah, you're like, oh my gosh, that's so cool that you're getting more education. I really hope that therapy, number one, therapy in 9 years since she died has changed. Like there's so many tools now that EMDR is super effective for trauma therapy. Yeah. I do during winter light therapy because I'm sensitive to that. Yeah. I get a massage almost weekly because of lupus. Yeah. For me, and my grief, like losing Meg, got in my bones. Yeah. And so would you think of massage? Are you embarrassed about getting massage? Like, if we normalize therapy as one tool, and it's a big tool, and it has variety now. It's not just sitting on the couch talking to someone over and over about your problems. When people say to me, I've been in therapy, it didn't help. I'm like, well, have you ever had a bad haircut? You don't stop getting your hair done. You like crowdsource it on social, or you text your friends like, I need a new person, right? if you've had therapy and it hasn't worked, go back to the drawing board. For me, hope is the plan B, plan C, plan D, plan E. And that's what Meg's story has done, is that Meg got tired and she believed the lie. And so one of the things I say is stay in your body. These bodies that are not perfect, mine definitely, I wish I could be like the Apple iPhone trade-in for 13 point or whatever we are on iPhones, like the 15 version or the 17. Like all of us have things we wish we could fix. But we're not going to be better without you. Like, I'm so passionate about saying that especially if you've had addiction or you feel like you've let people down or you keep failing or we're still not going to be better without you. There's not like a kid out there that's the extra kid, that's like the appendix of our lives that we can do better without. And I'm not trying to oversimplify it. I'm saying it's complex. Mental health is complex. Yeah. It deserves our attention and normalization.
What was your last interaction like with your sister?
Do you know what? In all the interviews I've been asked, I mean, I have talked about her on thousands of podcasts. No one has asked me that question. So high five to you on podcast interviewing. That is a beautiful question. This is a really sacred story, and I share it sensitively. So I hope it's received this way. But I really appreciate you asking me it. Yeah. I remember one day, so I often said for Meg that I, as her big sister, thought I could save her. And I very much believe there's only one Savior. And for me, it's Jesus Christ. And so I want people that have lost someone to suicide to know that it's very important you heal in that space in your heart that feels like you didn't save them. And for me, it was complicated because I had helped her out of the pit many times in her life where she would sink in that pit. I would call her. We would get on the phone. We would talk it through, or I would send her something in the mail. She always, the last few years of our lives, we didn't live in the same state, so I didn't have access to her, right? In the same way, like I couldn't just take her to lunch or go to the movies and so she had fallen into that pit at Christmas time again. And I remember by February, she wasn't answering the phone. She wasn't getting the mail. She wasn't answering texts. And my mom and dad lived close to her and had they had postponed a trip at Christmas time to see my other siblings. And they had postponed that trip because she was not in a good space. But in March, they decided she was doing a little better. It was safe to leave. And a few weeks before she passed, I remember specifically standing in the bathroom getting ready to go somewhere. And I had the thought, you need to write a letter to Meg. And I thought, okay, well, I need to finish getting ready, doing my hair or whatever. And the next thought was, and it will be the last thing she'll hear from you. Now, this is where I'm sensitive in telling you this, because at this point, I know people in your audience have family members that have chronically struggled. And they have this fear, just like we did, that we were going to lose her, right? And a lot of families, and this is why I love this question, are tired because they've tried the therapy. They've tried all the things, and they know the worst fear is they're going to get that phone call, right? And so having that impression for me was from God. And for me, I remember saying to God, well, that's dumb. I'm going to write her a card. Like, don't you want me to get on an airplane and fly to her? And I could feel God just like, this is what I need you to do. So I had sent her a million letters, not a million, but it felt like that over the years of her lifetime. And so I stopped getting ready, went down, wrote out a simple card, just like, I love you. I think I said something like, and I have the card still because when I went through her stuff, I didn't know she had even gotten the mail and opened it, and she had. And it just said something like, you have a lifeline. There's hope. I love you. You're the greatest. Something simple. And I mailed it to her. And I think this is an important conversation to have around mental health because boundaries are healthy. And that means sometimes you can't always do something about it. The boundary is that you've done what you can. And my parents chose to go on that trip because they had to have a healthy boundary. They had tried. They had had conversations with her. She'd gone back to college. She was living on her own. She was active in our church. She was meeting with a therapist regularly. She was meeting with our church leader, our bishop, who was so good to her. And so there were lots of things the last 5 years of her life that were good. But then my birthday came 1st of February and I didn't hear from her. And so by March, when my parents were on that trip, I knew she wasn't coming out of the pit. I had sent that little card. I had kind of just let it go as an offering. And then it was my mom's birthday. And my parents had stopped through Utah to go home to California. And it was my mom's birthday. And we hadn't heard from her. And my brother lived in town at the time. And so he had called my mom for her birthday. And something felt off all day. And my mom kept crying. And we were just like, you know, when you just feel something in your gut. And I'm sensitive to this part of the story, but they asked my brother to go over to my parents' house and see if she was there. And he's the one who found her.
He got into the house and then...
Yeah. And she had been gone already for a day or so. And she had put a note and she had left the keys out and her identity or her driver's license and had taken the garbage cans out. And this is a very sensitive thing, but often happens when we lose someone. There's a process of planning. And I will say this, that planning her funeral that first few weeks was just like my living hell. And then the nightmares and the reality of the grief. And the reason I am vulnerable in sharing on podcasts about this is I have heard from thousands and thousands and thousands of people on social media or that have read my books or heard a podcast that are making a plan. And springtime is a very sensitive time. People think it's the winter that we lose more, but it's spring.
Why is that?
Is the highest number. I believe it's because there's kind of this like everyone survives the winter and then the spring, the change of seasons. If you're sensitive, if your mental health is sensitive, there can be a shift in the seasons that feel like, well, I should be better now, right? And so there's some research there about that is a little bit more technical, but we lost her in the spring. And so the reason I'm a little more vulnerable and open and transparent about that last time is that I didn't ever hear from her, but I said what I had hoped to say to her. And I know because of my faith that she knows that she wants us to continue to heal and move forward and to share her story. She's definitely my partner in that. But I hope when I hear people talk about hearing something or seeing a post of mine on social media or picking up a book that I wrote or something like that, these podcasts, they save lives. And what I hear from people is they hear my voice in their head or you saying something about staying in their body, that we won't be better without them, that my life isn't better without them. And so what I want you to know is whatever you're feeling, that you've messed up too many times or that the depression has gone on so long that you're a burden to your family, that is the lie. And the truth is we need what you have learned in this stewardship. This is a really hard stewardship. If you have a lifetime of mental health struggles, I know you're tired. That's what I say to people. I know you're tired. My sister got tired. But I know if she was sitting right here on the couch with us, she would say, keep trying the next plan B.
Did her letter that she left say anything that would indicate where her mind was? I mean, you kind of knew, but...
She felt like she had done all she could and that she had failed and that it wasn't anyone's fault. You know, for me, spiritually, I would say it's a war, you know, and I don't mean that mental health is a spiritual, like, problem. I think that it's a vulnerability.
Totally.
When you're dealing with mental health and you're a person of faith, it can feel at war because you're somehow like, so what's wrong with you? That people around you are loving you or God maybe is loving you and you can't even feel it. So those that deal with chronic anxiety or depression, I always say, think of it as like a lens that you're, you know, I have my glasses that I have bifocals now. And so sometimes my perspective is like, these are my faraway glasses or these are my bifocals and they're dirty and I have to clean the lens. And if I don't have the right ones, it distorts what I'm looking at. Can you just acknowledge that if you're dealing with depression or anxiety, your lens is different? You're going to see a relationship or you're going to see a spiritual experience or you're going to go to church and have a different encounter. Can you just acknowledge logically, you almost need to tell yourself, oh yeah, these are my bifocals. It's distorting the far away because these are my reading glasses. that can be exhausting. And so what I often try to tell groups when I speak in schools, especially I say to kids, your frontal cortex isn't even fully developed yet.
Yeah.
Do not make a decision. Suicide is about one decision our loved ones have made that changed their other decisions. It's not all of who they are. Right. But I don't ever hide that that's how she died. Yeah. Because I want to remove the shame.
Yeah.
And so sometimes when I read obituaries or I hear people sensitive about talking about it after someone has died by suicide, I'm like, we need to normalize the conversation. It's not all of who my sister was, but it was one decision she made. And especially with teenagers, research has shown they're making their decisions within 15 minutes. They don't even have brain development yet. And so they have a breakup. They don't get on the basketball team. They don't get asked to prom. There's no frontal cortex full development and life experience to say, okay, this is a really hard time. This is a hard month. This is not my forever life. They don't have that. So when I'm in high schools or junior highs, I'm pretty bold about like literally your brain isn't fully developed. The end of your story hasn't happened. Do not make a decision that changes your other decisions. But for those of us that have lost someone, realize your loved one isn't all of that one decision either. I can hold space for all of what was wonderful and beautiful about Meg. And honestly, one of the last gifts she gave is, I know she wants me to tell her story. Yeah. I had my first book published. It was written but not accepted, submitted to my publisher, and then she died. And she wanted that first book published so badly. Her story wasn't in it yet because it hadn't happened. Oh. The minute she died, I could feel like she was going to make sure that book, whatever she could do from where she was at. And so when the publisher came to me 6 weeks later and said, we want to publish this, I rewrote what was in there. And now my very first book has her story as the first chapter.
So beautiful.
And so her story's out there because together, I've heard from people that say, I had a plan. I heard you on the radio. I had a plan. I heard you on a podcast. Not that I'm saving them, but it gives a perspective that your pain that you're feeling, your exhaustion you're feeling, I promise you the people left behind, that decision changes other decisions. And they don't want that. I promise you there's no one that is saying that this isn't complicated in families when there's mental health involved or addiction or betrayal, right? I'm saying some of those things because some of those things lead to the suicide decisions, but it's complex.
What is one thing that someone who feels suicidal, what's something they can do today? And also, what is something that loved ones of someone who they think might be suicidal, what is something they can, I don't want to say look out for, but what's something they can do for them?
Well, I think those are really important questions. Number one, let me answer the first. The first question, if you're the one feeling it, I hope you heard what I've said. Yeah. Like, we're not going to be better without you, and stay in your body. Your body is a stewardship, and part of that stewardship may be chronic mental health issues that you get to keep learning from and about. One of the things I would say is you're building muscles that are going to help a friend or a neighbor someday. One of my favorite stories is of a man. It's shared on one of my favorite shows, West Wing, where he's walking along, he falls in a pit, and he's yelling, help, help, help. And his rabbi walks by and throws a scripture in the pit. And then he keeps yelling, help, help, help. And the doctor walks by and throws a prescription. And then he yells, help, help, help. And his friend walks by, hears him, jumps in the pit. And he's like, dude, what are you doing? Now we're both stuck in the pit. And he's like, yeah, but I've been in this pit. I know the way out.
Wow.
So those that are listening that are dealing with that chronic health issue regarding their mental health, you're learning things that are going to be a gift to the world. I know it doesn't feel that way. It just feels like you're this mess up or that you don't have anything to offer because it's such a struggle. Number two, hope for me is the chronic plan B. Plan C, plan D, plan E. And so that's why I do these podcasts, because I have a really big toolbox at home. So if my fridge breaks and I don't know how to fix my fridge, but if I did.
Your proverbial fridge.
Yeah, my proverbial fridge. If I went and got a screwdriver out and it didn't fit, I would go find the next tool. Some days I dig through my mental health toolbox, and that's when I always call a faith friend, or I try light therapy, or I put on Elf Christmas music.
We watched that last night, actually.
Like literally I'll listen all year long because it shifts my neuroscience for a moment, right? And so I would just say it's hard, it's tiring, it's exhausting, and it's a marathon. But there's
For the families too, right?
For the families. That's the second part. For the families, I think it's important to understand where our family dynamics has changed, because especially if there's chronic mental health, there's an exhaustion of the family culture. And so I think it's really important to understand that having boundaries is loving. And it's okay for you to pull out of that savior role. You're in stewardship. You can invite, you can love, and you can influence, but you can't save. No one can. You can love, you can invite and influence, but you can't save.
And then don't be in that ownership realm if you're the parent and they
Full
do
circle.
end up passing because
Right.
they had a choice.
Right. And the reality is, I've talked to a lot of survivors of suicide. It's a very unique grief because it creates a what if in your head story that can be on a loop.
Oh.
And especially if you've been trying, if you have years of trying to get help for your loved one, you're always like, I have a few things in my life that I'm like, I loop a little bit. I can tell when I'm in vulnerability, I'm looping like, why didn't I call her and offer this one supplement or this one thing or this one, right? And the reality is I have to surrender that too, because my mental health, the family's mental health is just as important as the individual that's struggling. Even if they're the ones that are kind of at the emergency level all the time, I think we're in families for a long time.
Yeah.
And so it's not a one or done. Now, if you're dealing with someone, a loved one that all of a sudden has a situation of depression and anxiety, and it's a new part of their journey, it's a new stewardship for them, it's not a chronic thing, then there's so many great resources right now. One of the ones that I love to suggest that's free, Cook Center for Human Connection developed a free resource called parentguidance.org.
Parentguidance.org. Okay.
Right. I was named the Cook Center Influencer for Good this year. And I love this resource, one, because it's free. Two, it's focused on parents, but anyone can visit it. And it has a group of therapists available. So if your question isn't already answered on the app, on the tool, on the website, you can submit it. And there's a group of therapists that will answer it. And so parentguidance.org, there's so many tools now and apps. There's so many more therapies now to say, for your loved one that all of a sudden is exhibiting these signs. I often get asked questions from like church leaders and parents and educators. Is my child or teen just trying to get attention? And what I often say exactly that. Who cares?
Yeah, then they need attention.
Then they need attention. All that is a symptom, right? All they're telling you is something is off. And so when we sit around our kitchen tables and we say high-low check-ins with each other, I love to tell parents, start a group chat with your kids, especially your teens that have cell phones, and they know all the emojis out there. But start a group chat of everyone check in where you're at mental health wise. And there's enough emojis out there, just like there are emotions. Sometimes we think every emotion is either happy, sad, or mad. But we're so complex.
Yeah.
We have as many emotions as there are emojis.
Yeah.
And then when you see that you've created a culture where we talk about this, we celebrate therapy as education. We make it okay to say, I'm not feeling okay. We talk about tools in a way that, okay, the tools aren't working today. We're going to try a different tool. One of those tools is boundaries. One of the things I've had to learn as the oldest that wants to save my parents, my siblings, my friends, everyone, is that I have to be well. It's the proverbial oxygen on the airplane before you give it to your child analogy, right? Yeah. But families are complex. And so if you have to have a different boundary, or you have to get something that's an in-house treatment so that someone goes to a facility, all of those are gradual steps that sometimes we do take. And that's painful and that's complex. And we do the best we can with the information we have at the time. And especially if your loved one is over the age of 18, you are so in stewardship. Yeah. You cannot force them to go to that new therapist or try that new medicine or whatever that is. And so I think it's crucial for overall mental health in a family to say we're in boundaries, and boundaries are loving.
I hate that you had to go through that, but you are such a light and such an example because of it. And you've helped so many people, and you have so much insightful information that, I mean, the whole time you're talking, I'm just like, all these things that have applied even to my own life and to loved ones' lives. I'm so thankful. Thank you so much for coming on and being willing to talk about this.
And thank you for what you're doing and the good that you're doing and the conversations you're inviting people to have. Because I think as much as you and I talked before we started taping, social media can be
brutal.
And it's a sticky nest of like comparisons and all the things. I have a respect for the stewardship of social media, and it's why I'm still there. Because you never know what your post of good does, or your vulnerability, or saying like, I'll post just as much the bad days on my accounts as the good days. It's not all about publishing a new book or a speaking event or TV or guesting on a podcast. It's sometimes really hard days of feeling hurt by something that's happened, or insecure myself, or self-doubt. And so I think when we normalize those kinds of conversations, which I know you invite your guests to be vulnerable and honest, it changes us as a humanity. Like, we are having a very mortal human experience, and we're all dealing with stewardships that are great and hard at the same time. And sometimes I feel like I'm doing really good stewarding, and then I slip into ownership. I'm failing that semester big time. In my mind, it's like we're all getting a degree, And some semesters are tough, and sometimes I'm not doing great. And some semesters feel like I'm doing pretty good. Yeah. I'm doing my homework. I'm turning my assignments in. I'm getting A's. Other semesters, I'm just crawling through. And I've lived through those seasons, and I'm grateful to talk about my scars. I try to not come on shows and talk about my current bleeding wounds, but I'll come back when they've scarred up a little. But, I do try to be open, because when your guests are that way, it inspires me, and you've created that space. So thanks for the invitation and the time.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it.